Come closer, dear listener, and step with me beyond the noise of the modern world, into a place where time itself seems reluctant to move. Tonight's mystery unfolds behind ancient stone walls, beneath vaulted ceilings that have absorbed centuries of whispered prayers, confessions, and secrets never meant to be spoken aloud. Briarwood Abbey stands apart from the surrounding countryside, its dark silhouette rising above rain-soaked fields like a monument to silence. Once a place of devotion, it now serves as a secluded retreat for those seeking solitude, reflection, or concealment. Its corridors echo faintly with footsteps long gone, and its cloisters are thick with the scent of damp stone and incense. Here, even voices seem to lower themselves out of respect for the past. On the night our story begins, a select group of guests has gathered within the Abbey's walls. They have come under various pretenses: charity, scholarship, spiritual renewal. Some arrive burdened by guilt, others by ambition, and a few by intentions far less noble. They dine together in the refectory beneath flickering candlelight, sharing polite conversation and carefully measured smiles. And then, without warning, a glass slips from trembling fingers. The sound is small, but its consequences are not. Within moments, a guest lies dying on the cold stone floor, lips stained, breath failing, eyes wide with realization. Panic spreads through the Abbey like smoke, curling into every chamber, seeping into every thought. Doors are closed. Accusations remain unspoken, but already suspicion has taken root. Poison, a method that speaks of patience rather than passion, of calculation rather than chaos. Poison does not strike blindly. It waits, it watches, and it requires knowledge. Whoever administered it did so with care and with confidence. It is into this charged atmosphere that Hercule Poirot is summoned. He arrives not as a man seeking adventure, but as one disturbed by imbalance.
Poirot is drawn to places where order has been violated, where human behavior reveals its most telling contradictions. From the moment he steps inside Briarwood Abbey, he senses the tension woven into its stone walls. Politeness masks fear, faith conceals resentment, and every guest has something they would rather keep hidden. As Poirot begins to observe, the glances exchanged across the refectory, the pauses before answers, the rituals that no longer comfort but constrain, he understands that this is no simple act of malice. The Abbey has become a closed world, sealed by rain and secrecy, and the truth lies somewhere within its sacred boundaries. Tonight, you are invited to walk those corridors with him. Listen for what is not said, watch for what does not belong, and remember, in a place devoted to purity, corruption can be the hardest thing to detect. Welcome to Briarwood Abbey. A death at the refectory table. Rain had been falling over Briarwood Abbey since late afternoon, the steady, deliberate kind that seemed less like weather and more like intent. It soaked the surrounding fields, darkened the ancient stone walls, and traced thin black rivers down the stained glass windows that lined the Abbey's refectory. Inside, candles burned low, their flames bending subtly whenever a draught crept through the vast hall. Dinner was nearing its end. The guests sat along a long oak table polished smooth by centuries of use. Though the Abbey no longer housed monks, its rituals lingered stubbornly in the architecture. The high arched ceiling, the austere benches, the quiet expectation
that voices should never rise too loudly. Conversation moved politely, carefully, never lingering too long on personal matters. At the head of the table sat Dr. Leonard Ashcroft, a man of refined manners and scholarly reputation. He was the reason this gathering existed at all. Officially,
The guests had been invited to discuss the future funding of historical preservation projects connected to Briarwood Abbey. Unofficially, each of them knew that Ashcroft's influence and his considerable wealth could change their lives. Ashcroft lifted his glass. "To generosity," he said warmly, "and to legacy." The others followed suit. Moments later, the glass slipped from his hand. At first, it seemed an accident, an unsteady grip, perhaps fatigue. The crystal struck the stone floor and shattered, the sharp sound echoing violently through the refectory. Ashcroft's chair scraped backward as he lurched to his feet, one hand clutching his throat. Silence collapsed into chaos. Ashcroft's face drained of color. His lips darkened unnaturally, and a thin line of saliva escaped the corner of his mouth. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a choking sound that sent a chill through the room. "Doctor!" cried Sister Agnes, rushing forward. Ashcroft fell. His body struck the floor heavily, the impact reverberating through the ancient hall. Guests leapt from their seats, chairs clattering. Someone screamed. Another guest stood frozen, glass still raised, eyes locked in horror. Father Benedict, the abbey's caretaker, knelt beside the fallen man, his fingers trembling as he searched for a pulse. After a few seconds, he looked up slowly, his face pale. "He's gone." The words settled heavily, like dust after a collapse. No one spoke. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the windows with renewed insistence, as though sealing the abbey from the outside world. Doors were closed, servants dismissed. Father Benedict insisted everyone remain where they were. "This is no place for panic," he said, though his voice shook. "We must proceed calmly." Calm, however, had already fled. Within the hour, a message was sent to the nearest village, and within 2 more, Hercule Poirot arrived. He entered the abbey quietly, wiping rain from his coat, his sharp eyes taking in everything at once. The nervous guests, the overturned chair, the shattered glass still glinting faintly on the floor. Poirot knelt, examining the remnants with careful precision. "Poison," he said calmly. A collective shudder passed through the room. "Which kind?" asked Professor Eleanor Vaughan, her voice taut. Poirot straightened. "That, madame, is a question that will occupy us for some time." He surveyed the assembled guests. Each wore a different mask: grief, shock, impatience, fear. But beneath them all, Poirot sensed something else: calculation. "This abbey," Poirot continued, "is now a closed circle. Until we understand what has happened, no one leaves." Outside, thunder rolled across the countryside. Inside Briarwood Abbey, the game had begun. The refectory of Briarwood Abbey had been transformed from a place of measured civility into one of restrained dread. Chairs stood where they had been abandoned, some half-turned, others toppled in haste. The shattered remains of Dr. Leonard Ashcroft's glass had been swept aside, yet its absence seemed louder than its presence ever had. Death, Poirot knew, rearranged rooms as surely as it rearranged lives. Hercule Poirot requested that the guests remain seated. "Order," he said gently, raising a hand.
is not the enemy of truth. Panic is. Father Benedict stood nearby, hands folded within his robes, his expression one of practiced calm, strained thin by circumstance. The abbey's caretaker had lived among stone walls long enough to know that silence could be either sacred or dangerous. "We must cooperate," Father Benedict said. "This place was built for reflection, not suspicion." Poirot inclined his head. "Yet suspicion, mon père, has already entered. We must give it form, or it will poison us all." He turned to the guests. There were 7 in total, excluding Father Benedict and Sister Agnes. 7 people who had shared a table, a meal,
And, knowingly or not, the final moments of Leonard Ashcroft's life. Poirot began not with accusations, but with names. Professor Eleanor Vaughan, historian and academic, whose research grants had been repeatedly denied until Ashcroft's sudden interest. Mr. Harold Finch, a financial advisor whose firm managed several of Ashcroft's investments. Mrs. Lucinda Merritt, patron of charitable causes, outwardly serene but sharply observant. Captain Julian Rowe, retired military officer with a rigid bearing and an undisguised dislike for scholarly men. Sister Agnes, invited at Ashcroft's request to advise on the Abbey's restoration. And finally, Mr. Peter Langley, Ashcroft's private secretary, a young man who looked as though he had not slept in days. Poirot watched them as he spoke. Not one moved unnecessarily. That, in itself, was telling. "The poison," Poirot said calmly, "was administered during the meal, not before, not after. Therefore, the opportunity was shared equally." "Are you saying one of us is a murderer?" Captain Rowe demanded. Poirot met his gaze. "I am saying one of you made a decision." The distinction unsettled them. Poirot requested that the table be examined. Plates were inspected, cutlery noted. No residue, no bitterness reported by those who had tasted the wine. The bottle itself, retrieved from the sideboard, appeared unremarkable. "Then how?" whispered Mrs. Merritt. Poirot gestured toward the fallen chair. "Dr. Ashcroft alone drank from that glass, and only after a pause." Langley swallowed audibly. "He hesitated," he said, as if distracted. Poirot's eyes flicked to him. "Distracted by what?" Langley hesitated. "By a note." "A note?" Poirot repeated softly. Langley nodded. "A folded paper. I assumed it was correspondence. He read it just before lifting the glass." Poirot felt the shape of the evening shift subtly. Notes were personal. Notes were deliberate. "Where is this paper?" Poirot asked. Langley shook his head. It was gone when he fell. The rain intensified, rattling the windows like impatient fingers. Poirot asked the guests to recount their movements during the meal, who stood, who poured wine, who approached Ashcroft's seat. Answers came smoothly, too smoothly. Each story was polished, rehearsed, safe. Poirot turned his attention to the Abbey itself. "Briarwood Abbey," he said, walking slowly along the refectory's edge, "is a place of tradition. But tradition leaves traces, old passages, old habits." Father Benedict stiffened almost imperceptibly. "There are service corridors," the priest admitted, "used by monks long ago." "And still accessible?" Poirot asked. "Yes." Opportunity, Poirot thought, expanded. As the questioning concluded, Poirot requested the guests retire to their rooms. No one protested. Each face carried relief at leaving the refectory and fear of being alone.
Sister Agnes lingered. "This place has seen many deaths," she said quietly, "but never one like this." Poirot regarded her kindly. "Poison," he replied, "is the weapon of patience, and patience requires planning." When Poirot was finally alone, he returned to the spot where Ashcroft had fallen. He knelt, studying the floor carefully. There, barely visible, was a faint, dark stain where the glass had shattered, and beside it, something else. A scrap of paper, crushed beneath a chair leg. Poirot lifted it delicately. It bore only 3 words, written in Ashcroft's own hand. "I know everything." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. So, the poison had not merely killed a man, it had silenced a truth. And whoever had chosen that method believed time and the Abbey would protect them. They were wrong. Briarwood Abbey changed character at night. By day, its ancient corridors possessed a scholarly calm, softened by filtered light and the distant sounds of rain on stone. But after midnight, when lamps burned low and shadows gathered in the arches,
The Abbey revealed its true nature. Not peaceful, but watchful. Hercule Poirot felt it keenly as he walked its halls, cane tapping softly, every sense alert. He had not gone to bed. Sleep, Poirot believed, was unproductive when the mind was arranging truth. The scrap of paper, "I know everything," rested securely in his pocket. It had altered the nature of the crime entirely. Dr. Leonard Ashcroft had not been poisoned at random. He had been silenced at the precise moment he intended to speak, and that meant urgency. Poirot began with the Abbey's service corridors. Father Benedict had reluctantly provided a rough map, tracing the old passages with his finger. These narrow stone routes once allowed monks to move unseen between chambers. Though no longer officially used, they had never been sealed. Tradition, like secrecy, was difficult to dismantle. Poirot followed one such corridor now, its walls cool and damp beneath his fingertips. The air smelled faintly of wax and age. Footsteps echoed more loudly here, forcing him to slow his pace. Halfway down the passage, he stopped. A door stood ajar. Poirot nudged it open with his cane. Inside was a small storeroom, shelves lined with cleaning supplies and unused candlesticks. On the stone floor lay something out of place, a silver teaspoon. He knelt. The spoon bore faint discoloration at its tip, not enough to notice casually, but enough for Poirot's trained eye. "Ah," he murmured, "preparation." Poisons rarely traveled alone. They required instruments, timing, and access. A teaspoon suggested liquid, subtle, measured. Poirot returned the spoon carefully to its place and continued. Later that morning, he requested to speak individually with the guests. Professor Eleanor Vaughan came first. She sat stiffly, fingers interlaced, her sharp intellect barely masking her agitation. "Ashcroft promised funding," she said. "But promises are not crimes." "No," Poirot agreed, "but broken ones sometimes inspire them." Her gaze hardened. I would never poison a man. Poirot smiled politely. I did not ask. Captain Julian Rowe followed. His military bearing did not falter, but impatience radiated from him. "This is an inconvenience," Rowe snapped. "I detest cowards who kill without facing their enemy." "And yet,"
Poirot replied calmly. "Poison requires courage of a different sort." Rowe said nothing more. Mrs. Lucinda Merritt was next, elegant, controlled, her eyes revealed very little. "Ashcroft was reckless," she said quietly. "He enjoyed leverage." "And did he possess leverage over you?" Poirot asked. She paused, just a moment, too long. "He possessed leverage over many," she replied. Poirot noted it. When Peter Langley entered, his composure collapsed almost immediately. His hands trembled. "I only delivered messages," he insisted. "I never read them." "Except the last one," Poirot said gently. Langley flinched. "He wrote it himself, after reading a note left at his place setting." "A note you did not see?" Langley shook his head. "It was gone." Gone. Always gone. Finally, Poirot sought Sister Agnes. She stood by a window overlooking the cloister, candlelight softening her severe features. "This abbey," Poirot said quietly, "has taught you much about discipline." "And obedience," she replied. "And silence," Poirot added. Her eyes met his steadily. "Some truths destroy faith." Poirot inclined his head. "Only false faith." That afternoon, Poirot returned to the refectory alone. He studied the seating arrangement carefully. Who sat nearest Ashcroft? Who had risen? Who had access to the sideboard? The answer was clear. More than one person. But only one had both opportunity and reason to act precisely at that moment. Poirot looked once more at the long oak table and smiled faintly. The Abbey's silence was no longer impenetrable. It was beginning to crack. Buried ledger. Morning light filtered weakly through the stained glass windows of Briarwood Abbey, casting fractured patterns of red,
Blue, and gold across the cold stone floor. To the casual eye, the Abbey appeared unchanged, solemn, timeless, dignified. But to Hercule Poirot, the building now felt restless, as though its walls strained beneath the weight of something long concealed. Secrets, Poirot reflected, were like damp trapped in stone. Ignore them long enough, and they rotted the structure from within. Poirot requested access to the Abbey's administrative records shortly after breakfast. Father Benedict hesitated, then agreed, leading him to a narrow chamber tucked behind the cloisters. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with bound ledgers, donation registers, and correspondence dating back decades. "This abbey has depended on benefactors," Father Benedict said quietly. "Without them, Briarwood would not survive." "And benefactors," Poirot replied, "often expect discretion." He began methodically, his fingers gliding along spines until he found what he sought. Records from the past 5 years, the period during which Dr. Leonard Ashcroft had become deeply involved with the Abbey's finances. The entries were meticulous, too meticulous. Poirot noticed small discrepancies first, amounts rounded too neatly, dates that clustered unnaturally close together. Donations listed under one name, but dispersed across several accounts. "Father Benedict," Poirot said gently, "who prepared these records?" The priest stiffened. "Dr. Ashcroft assisted. He was thorough." Poirot nodded. Thoroughness, when selective, was revealing. As he read further, a pattern emerged. Large donations earmarked for restoration had been rerouted, legally, on paper,
into private trusts and auxiliary funds. The abbey remained solvent, but others had benefited quietly, very quietly. Poirot closed the ledger. "Dr. Ashcroft discovered this," he said calmly. "Did he not?" Father Benedict's silence was answer enough. "He intended to expose it," Poirot continued. "That is why he wrote,
'I know everything.'"
The priest lowered himself into a chair, suddenly older. "He confronted me," he admitted. "He said the abbey had become compromised, that charity had been exploited." "And you?" Poirot asked. "I begged him to reconsider," Father Benedict whispered, "to handle it privately." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "But someone else preferred a permanent solution." That afternoon, Poirot revisited the guests with renewed purpose. Professor Vaughan grew defensive when Poirot mentioned misdirected funds. "My grants were delayed," she snapped, "but I never stole." Captain Rowe scoffed openly. "Money bores me. Ashcroft's threat meant nothing." Poirot smiled politely. Lies often spoke louder when dismissed. Mrs. Lucinda Merritt reacted differently. Her composure faltered. "I donated generously," she said carefully. "I trusted the abbey." "And yet," Poirot replied softly, "some donations arrived bearing your name, but not your signature." Her breath caught. Poirot pressed no further for now. Finally, he spoke again with Peter Langley. The young secretary was unraveling. "Ashcroft kept copies," Langley whispered. "He told me if anything happened to him, everything would come out." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "And where are these copies?" Langley hesitated. "Hidden. Somewhere in the abbey." As Poirot walked alone later that evening, his mind was perfectly ordered. Ashcroft had been poisoned not merely for what he knew, but for what he intended to do: expose benefactors, ruin reputations, strip the abbey of its quiet protections. Someone had decided that preserving Briarwood's image was worth a life, and poison, silent, patient, and discreet, had been the chosen guardian of that lie. Poirot paused in the cloister, listening to the echo of his footsteps. The abbey had kept its secrets for years, but not for much longer. In a place devoted to restraint, poison was an audacity. Hercule Poirot reflected on this as he stood alone in the abbey's small infirmary,
A room rarely used and faintly scented with antiseptic and old herbs. Briarwood Abbey prided itself on simplicity: plain meals, modest comforts, predictable routines. Introducing poison into such an environment required not only access, but confidence. The killer had believed they understood the abbey better than anyone else. Poirot intended to prove them wrong. The shattered wineglass had already been removed, but the bottle from which Dr. Leonard Ashcroft had poured remained sealed in the infirmary cabinet. Poirot examined it closely, holding it to the light. The cork was intact, the wine untainted. "Good," Poirot murmured. "Then the poison traveled alone." He turned his attention to the refectory kitchen. Sister Agnes met him there, sleeves rolled up, her movements precise as she supervised the quiet cleaning of utensils. The atmosphere was subdued, almost reverent. No one raised their voice. "You prepare all the meals?" Poirot asked. "Yes," she replied. "With assistance. We keep the kitchen locked when not in use." "Except during dinner?" "Except then." Poirot examined the spice rack, rows of small glass jars labeled neatly: salt,
pepper, nutmeg, cloves, and one container slightly out of alignment. He lifted it. "Bitter almond," he said. Sister Agnes stiffened. "For baking." "Indeed," Poirot replied calmly. "And also to mask certain flavors." He replaced the jar gently. The poison, Poirot suspected, had been dissolved into a liquid, perhaps a cordial, perhaps water, and administered with care. The silver teaspoon he had found in the service corridor returned to his thoughts. Poirot next visited the Abbey's herb garden, a modest plot enclosed by stone walls. Though late in the season, several plants still thrived. Foxglove, belladonna, hemlock, cultivated carefully, responsibly, for medicinal study. Captain Julian Rowe stood nearby, arms crossed, staring at the plants with visible distaste. "Poison garden," he muttered. "Unnatural." "On the contrary," Poirot replied.
"Nature is most honest here," Rowe scoffed. "Anyone could take something." "Yes," Poirot said, "but only someone who knew precisely what to take." That knowledge narrowed the field. Poirot requested Dr. Ashcroft's personal effects, his coat, his briefcase, his papers. Peter Langley handed them over with trembling hands. "There were drafts," Langley whispered. "Letters he never sent." Poirot examined them carefully. Names appeared again and again. Donations, quiet arrangements. Mrs. Lucinda Merritt's name surfaced frequently, always in connection with trusts that never quite aligned. Poirot paid her a visit. She received him in the Abbey's small library, sunlight catching in her carefully arranged hair. She listened without interruption as Poirot spoke of the ledgers, the trusts, and Ashcroft's discoveries. "He intended to ruin me," she said softly. "He intended to reveal the truth," Poirot corrected. Her composure fractured. "I protected this abbey. Without me, it would have closed years ago." "And so," Poirot said gently, "you protected it with poison?" She laughed, a short, brittle sound. "I didn't mean to kill him." Poirot's eyes hardened. "Poison is never an accident, madame." Silence stretched between them. That night, Poirot returned to the service corridor. He retrieved the silver teaspoon from where he had left it. A faint residue remained. Enough. The poison had not come from the garden. It had come from the infirmary cabinet. Access restricted. Knowledge required. And someone had ensured Ashcroft read a note, "I know everything," at precisely the moment the poison would take effect. Poirot replaced the spoon and straightened. The Abbey had tried to hide its crime behind ritual and reverence, but poison, Poirot knew, always betrayed its handler. And soon, so would the murderer. By the 6th day, Briarwood Abbey no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become a chamber of held breath, where every footstep echoed too loudly, and every door seemed to close with deliberate finality. Rain returned in short, impatient bursts, streaking the stone walls and turning the cloisters slick beneath foot. For Hercule Poirot, the weather merely sharpened the edges of a case already coming into focus. He had learned enough about the poison. Now he needed to understand the lie that had allowed it to be used. Poirot began the morning by requesting that the Abbey's daily routines continue as normal. Breakfast at the same hour, prayers observed, guests allowed to walk the grounds, but never alone. It was a calculated decision. When people believed themselves watched, they controlled their faces. When they believed routine had returned, they made mistakes. He stationed himself in the cloister shortly after morning prayers.
Professor Eleanor Vaughan exited the chapel first, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She paused when she saw Poirot, offering a stiff nod. "You look troubled, madame," Poirot said gently. She laughed without humor. "Everyone here is troubled." "Some more than others," Poirot replied. She hesitated. "Ashcroft believed knowledge gave him power. He didn't understand what it costs to reveal certain truths." "And you?" Poirot asked. "I understood," she said quietly. "That is why I stayed silent." Poirot nodded. Silence again. Always silence. Later, Poirot observed Captain Julian Rowe in the courtyard, pacing with restless energy. The retired officer stopped abruptly when Poirot approached. "You think I'm capable of poisoning a man?" Rowe said bluntly. Poirot smiled faintly. "I think you are capable of violence. Poison requires something else." "Patience?" Rowe snapped. "Self-restraint," Poirot corrected. "And planning." Rowe snorted. "Not my style." That, Poirot thought, was true. At midday, Poirot paid a quiet visit to the infirmary once more. The cabinet stood locked, just as it should. Sister Agnes arrived moments later, her expression unreadable.
"You've returned," she said. "Yes," Poirot replied, "because this room is very interesting." She said nothing. "Tell me," Poirot continued calmly, "how often do guests visit this infirmary?" "Rarely," she replied. "Only when unwell." "And Dr. Ashcroft?" Her eyes flickered. "He complained of headaches." Poirot inclined his head. "Then you would have offered him something mild, a tonic, a cordial." Her fingers tightened around her rosary. "Faith," Poirot said softly, "teaches discipline. But discipline, when misused, becomes control." She met his gaze steadily. "Are you accusing me?" "I am observing," Poirot replied. That afternoon, Poirot arranged another private meeting, this time in the Abbey library. All the guests were present. Mrs. Lucinda Merritt sat rigidly, her elegance strained. Peter Langley hovered near the shelves, pale and exhausted. Poirot spoke calmly. "Dr. Ashcroft was poisoned using a substance accessed through the infirmary. The poison was administered by spoon, dissolved into a liquid, and timed precisely. This required familiarity, privacy, and trust." He let the words settle. "Only 2 people had unrestricted access to that cabinet," Poirot continued. "Dr. Ashcroft himself and Sister Agnes." A sharp intake of breath rippled through the room. Sister Agnes did not move. "But," Poirot added, raising a finger, "access alone does not make a murderer. Motive does." He turned toward Mrs. Merritt. "You stood to lose everything," Poirot said quietly. "Your reputation, your influence, the Abbey itself." Mrs. Merritt's voice trembled. "I loved this place." "And you loved control," Poirot replied. She broke then, just slightly. "Enough." "I asked for help," she whispered. "I never meant—" Poirot's eyes shifted. "To kill?" he finished. Silence answered. Sister Agnes bowed her head. "I prepared the tonic," she said quietly. "She told me it would make him ill, enough to frighten him." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. Complicity.
the most dangerous kind of devotion.
"And when fear was not enough?" Poirot asked.
Sister Agnes whispered. It was too late. Poirot straightened. The illusion of holiness had shattered. The Abbey's crime was not the work of a monster, but of people who believed themselves justified. And justification, Poirot knew, was the deadliest poison of all. Briarwood Abbey had reached the point at which lies could no longer support one another. Hercule Poirot sensed it in the air as clearly as he sensed the rain that gathered once more above the cloisters. The building seemed to hold its breath, stone walls pressing inward as though the Abbey itself wished to force a confession from those who had misused its silence. Guilt, Poirot knew, behaved much like pressure. It sought release. The revelation of Sister Agnes's involvement had unsettled everyone, not because they believed her innocent, but because they had believed her incapable. Faith, when weaponized, frightened people far more than malice ever could. Poirot allowed the shock to settle before acting further. He understood the value of restraint. When people were shaken, they revealed themselves, not immediately, but in the moments that followed, when they believed the worst was over. He began by changing the routine. That afternoon, Poirot instructed Father Benedict to announce that arrangements were being made for the authorities to arrive the following morning. The guests were told that until then they would remain under observation but otherwise free to move about the Abbey grounds. "This is irregular," Father Benedict murmured privately. "Truth rarely arrives politely," Poirot replied. The announcement had the desired effect. Captain Rowe grew visibly restless, pacing the courtyard with increasing agitation. Professor Vaughan withdrew into her room, declining supper. Peter Langley hovered near Poirot repeatedly, as though seeking reassurance he dared not ask for. And Mrs. Lucinda Merritt, always composed, became excessively calm.
That calm concerned Poirot the most. He spent the evening walking the cloisters, appearing aimless, allowing the suspects to believe his attention had shifted elsewhere. In reality, every movement was calculated. He watched reflections in polished stone, listened to echoes behind him, and noted doors that opened and closed more often than necessary. Near midnight, Poirot paused near the infirmary. The door was ajar. He did not enter immediately. Instead, he waited. Footsteps approached softly. Mrs. Merritt emerged from the shadows, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She stopped short when she saw Poirot, surprise flickering across her face before being replaced by polite composure. "I couldn't sleep," she said lightly. "Neither could I," Poirot replied. They stood there, framed by the dim corridor, the infirmary door between them like an accusation. Poirot spoke gently. "You have carried this burden alone for many years, madame." Her eyes hardened. "I carried it for the Abbey." "Or for yourself?" Poirot asked. She laughed softly. "Is there truly a difference?" Poirot stepped aside, allowing her to pass. She did not move. "Dr. Ashcroft forced your hand," Poirot continued. "He believed truth was an absolute good. You believed it was conditional." Her composure cracked then, just enough. "He would have destroyed everything," she whispered. "Donors, reputations, the Abbey itself." "And so you destroyed him," Poirot said quietly. Tears welled in her eyes, though none fell. "I never intended it to go so far." Poirot shook his head slowly. "Poison is not an instrument of moderation." At that moment, a door opened behind them. Sister Agnes stood there, pale and shaken.
"I told you it would only frighten him," she said, her voice trembling. "You promised." Mrs. Merritt closed her eyes. Poirot observed them both carefully. The truth now stood exposed, but confession required one final step. "You believed," Poirot said softly, "that the Abbey would forgive you."
That devotion would excuse your actions. He stepped closer. But Briarwood Abbey is not a shield. It is a witness. Sister Agnes collapsed into a nearby chair, sobbing quietly. Mrs. Merritt stood rigid, her carefully constructed identity unraveling thread by thread. Outside, the Abbey bell began to toll the hour. Poirot straightened his coat. "The authorities will arrive in the morning," he said calmly. "What happens next depends on what you choose to say before then." He turned and walked away, leaving them alone with the weight of conscience. Behind him, the infirmary door closed softly. This time it did not reopen. The bells of Briarwood Abbey rang at dawn with a solemn clarity that cut through the lingering night air. Their sound rolled across the cloisters and spilled into the surrounding fields, steady and unhurried, as though time itself had decided to bear witness. Hercule Poirot stood near the refectory window, hands folded behind his back, watching the first pale light settle against the stone walls. Dawn, Poirot reflected, was an honest hour. People were too tired to pretend, too worn to maintain careful deceptions. Mrs. Lucinda Merritt had not returned to her room. Poirot learned this from Father Benedict shortly after the bells ceased. The priest's face was drawn, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "She's in the chapel," Father Benedict said quietly. "She asked to be alone." "Alone," Poirot murmured. "Yes, that is often when truth speaks most clearly." They found her seated in the front pew, hands clasped tightly, her posture rigid. Sunlight filtered through the stained glass, casting fractured colors across her face. She looked smaller now, stripped of the elegance that had once shielded her so effectively. "I suppose you've come for my confession," she said without turning. "I have come," Poirot replied gently, "to listen." She laughed softly. "Listening is all you ever do." She spoke then, not hurriedly,
but with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed these words countless times in silence. She spoke of the Abbey's finances, of donations diverted to preserve influence, of her belief that Briarwood Abbey was too important to be allowed to fail. "I told myself it was stewardship," she said, "protection. Without me it would have closed." "And Dr. Ashcroft?" Poirot asked. "He threatened exposure," she said bitterly. "He believed truth justified destruction." Poirot inclined his head. "And so you chose poison?" Her eyes filled. "I chose fear. I thought it would silence him long enough to regain control." "Poison," Poirot said quietly, "never negotiates." She bowed her head. Sister Agnes joined them soon after, her face pale, eyes swollen from tears. "I prepared the tonic," she whispered. "She told me it would only weaken him." Poirot regarded her sadly. "You allowed devotion to replace judgment." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chapel. Constable Henry Latham, summoned from the village overnight, entered with measured solemnity. He listened as Poirot summarized the events with calm precision. No embellishment, no accusation beyond necessity.
When Poirot finished, Latham nodded. "You'll both need to come with me." Mrs. Merritt rose without protest. Sister Agnes hesitated only briefly before following. As they were led away, Poirot remained seated, gazing up at the stained glass. Saints depicted acts of sacrifice, martyrdom, obedience. He wondered how often such ideals had been misused to justify cruelty. By mid-morning, Briarwood Abbey had begun to stir. Guests gathered quietly in the refectory, voices subdued but no longer fearful. Captain Rowe stared into his cup with grim contemplation. Professor Vaughan sat upright, expression tight but relieved. Peter Langley looked as though he had aged years overnight. Poirot addressed them calmly. "The truth has been spoken," he said. "Justice will proceed." No one asked questions.
There was nothing left to ask. Later, Poirot walked the cloisters alone. The rain had stopped. Sunlight warmed the stone beneath his feet. The abbey, though scarred by what had occurred within it, seems to breathe more freely. Truth, Poirot knew, did not heal instantly, but it prevented infection. As he reached the outer gate, he paused, listening to the bells once more. They rang now not as an alarm, but as acknowledgment. Briarwood Abbey would endure, changed, humbled, honest. And that, Poirot believed, was the only kind of sanctuary worth preserving. The Reckoning of Silence. With the departure of Mrs. Lucinda Merritt and Sister Agnes, Briarwood Abbey entered a strange, unsettled calm. It was not peace, not yet, but something closer to exhaustion, the kind that follows a long illness, when the body is weak but the fever has finally broken. Hercule Poirot felt it as he walked through the cloisters that afternoon, his footsteps echoing softly against stone that had absorbed centuries of prayer, denial, and quiet compromise. The guests remained, though they no longer clustered together for comfort. Each had retreated inward, forced now to confront the proximity of guilt, even if they themselves were not directly responsible. Poirot understood this well. Crimes of silence implicated more people than crimes of passion ever could. He found Professor Eleanor Vaughan seated in the library, surrounded by books she was not reading. "You look relieved," Poirot observed gently. She sighed. "Relief feels inappropriate." "Truth often does," Poirot replied. "It disrupts the narrative we prefer." She hesitated. "I suspected there were irregularities. I told myself it wasn't my place to question them." Poirot met her gaze. "And now?" "And now I see what restraint becomes when it is used as an excuse." He inclined his head. Lessons learned too late were still lessons. In the courtyard, Captain Julian Rowe paced beneath clearing skies. He stopped when Poirot approached. "I despised Ashcroft," Rowe said bluntly, "but I did not wish him dead."
"No," Poirot agreed. "You wished him silent."
Rowe's jaw tightened. "Perhaps."
"Silence," Poirot said, "is rarely neutral."
As evening approached, Poirot gathered the remaining guests in the refectory one final time. The long oak table looked smaller now, stripped of ceremony. Candles burned steadily, no longer flickering with tension. "I have not summoned you to accuse," Poirot said calmly. "That task is complete. I have summoned you to conclude." He spoke of Dr. Ashcroft not as a victim alone, but as a man who believed knowledge demanded responsibility.
He spoke of Mrs. Merritt and Sister Agnes not as monsters, but as people who allowed fear and devotion to outrank conscience. "And you," Poirot said, turning to the others, "must decide what you will do with what you now know." No one interrupted him. "Briarwood Abbey survived because many chose not to ask questions. It nearly died because one man finally did." The words settled heavily. Later that night, Poirot returned to the chapel alone. Moonlight filtered through the stained glass, bathing the floor in muted color. He stood for a long moment, reflecting not on the crime, but on its cost. Justice had been served, but justice did not erase complicity. It illuminated it. As Poirot left the chapel, he felt the abbey's silence shift, no longer oppressive, but contemplative. Silence, when earned, could be restorative. Tomorrow he would depart. Tonight, Briarwood Abbey would sit with its truth. And that, Poirot believed, was the final reckoning. Briarwood Abbey greeted its final morning in silence. Not the strained, watchful silence that had clung to its walls since the poisoning, but a quieter, steadier stillness, like the pause after a confession has been fully spoken. The rain had passed in the night, leaving the stone paths washed clean and glistening faintly beneath a pale sky.
For the first time since Hercule Poirot's arrival, the abbey felt settled. Poirot stood by the open window of his room, suitcase neatly packed at his side. He observed the cloister below as Father Benedict walked slowly across it, head bowed, his steps measured. The priest moved like a man carrying not guilt, but responsibility, an important distinction, Poirot thought. Guilt paralyzed, responsibility endured. Breakfast was a subdued affair. The remaining guests gathered quietly in the refectory, sitting farther apart than before, as though instinctively granting one another space. There was no awkwardness now, no guarded glances, only reflection. Professor Vaughan ate sparingly, her eyes distant. Captain Rowe sat stiff-backed, his expression unreadable but no longer hostile. Peter Langley looked exhausted, yet relieved, as if a burden he had carried unknowingly had finally been lifted. Poirot joined them briefly, offering polite conversation but no probing questions. His work here was complete. When truth had been spoken fully, further examination became intrusion. Constable Latham arrived mid-morning to finalize arrangements. Papers were signed, statements recorded. Briarwood Abbey, once isolated by rain and secrecy, was open again to law, to scrutiny, to consequence. "You will be leaving today, Monsieur Poirot?" Father Benedict asked quietly as they stood near the abbey gates. "Yes," Poirot replied. "This place no longer requires my presence." The priest hesitated. "Do you believe the abbey can recover?" Poirot looked back toward the stone walls, catching the sunlight at last. "Recovery," he said gently, "is not the same as forgetting. Briarwood Abbey will endure because it remembers." Before departing, Poirot returned one final time to the refectory. The long table stood empty now, candles unlit, the space returned to its intended simplicity. He paused at the spot where Dr. Leonard Ashcroft had fallen. Ashcroft had not been a perfect man. Poirot had seen that clearly. But he had believed, perhaps naively, that truth could be spoken without cost. Poirot adjusted his mustache thoughtfully. Truth always demanded payment. The tragedy lay not in that fact, but in pretending otherwise.
As Poirot stepped outside, the Abbey bells rang once more. This time they did not warn, they marked passage. Poirot entered the waiting motor car and took one last look at Briarwood Abbey as it receded behind him. Stone returned to stone. Silence returned to prayer. And somewhere within those walls, a lesson remained, etched more deeply than any inscription. Order had been violated. Order had been restored. And that, Poirot believed, was enough. Beneath silent stone. And so, dear listener, our time at Briarwood Abbey draws gently to a close. The candles have been extinguished. The cloisters stand quiet once more. Yet the silence that remains is no longer heavy with fear or concealment. It is the silence of understanding, earned through truth rather than enforced through denial. This was not merely a story of poison, but of devotion misplaced, of how loyalty, when severed from conscience, can become as dangerous as malice. Within those ancient walls, fear dressed itself as protection, and reverence became a shield for wrongdoing. And it took the careful mind of Hercule Poirot to remind us that order is not preserved by hiding corruption, but by confronting it. Dr. Leonard Ashcroft believed that truth, once spoken, could cleanse what secrecy had corrupted. His faith in that belief cost him his life. Yet in the end, it also restored balance to a place that had quietly drifted from its purpose. If this mystery made you pause, if a detail lingered in your thoughts or a character's choice unsettled you, I invite you to share your reflections. Who did you suspect first? Was there a moment when the truth became unavoidable? Your theories and insights are always welcome.
And if you found comfort in this slow-burn journey through shadowed corridors and moral uncertainty, remember to like, subscribe, and join us again. There are many places where silence still hides secrets, and many mysteries yet to be heard. Until next time, rest well, listen closely, and trust that order, though fragile, always seeks its return.